Hello, my name is Layton Livers. I'm with the Nelson County 4-H Extension Office, and today I will be teaching you how to paint with coffee. Here's everything you need to know. When painting with anything wet, it is important to remember a few things. Your painting is going to be wet, and it will not settle and stay like you're used to. If you've ever painted with acrylics or oil paints, then you'll know that they're pretty chunky and they tend to stay where you put them. This is not the case with watercolors and any other liquid form of paint. It is important for your painting to dry in between your steps. Otherwise, everything you paint will mix together and fade. It is important to limit yourself on dark colors in order to create proper values and layers, because when water-based paints are layered, they tend to lose vibrancy. Step 1. Background. Wet your entire watercolor with paper until slightly damp. Then spread a thin layer of coffee across the entire paper as well. This should make the paper just look slightly darker than before. After you are satisfied with the color of your background, wait to continue to the next step. I will grab my paintbrush, a bowl of water. I will just cover the canvas in it. You can't really see it, but the edges of my canvas are taped down because as you paint with watery paints, the paper tends to warp. It's better to tape all the way around the border instead of just in small pieces with Scotch tape like I did. Painter's tape is usually the best because it still warps, and around the border just tends to keep the edges in place better. So now I've covered it in a thin layer of water all the way across. I'm going to take my coffee here and I'll just spread it across, just like this. That should make things easier for you to see. Sorry. I'm just giving a good covering on the whole thing. You want this to be very light, just a light coating. Otherwise, when you add in your layers later, it won't look as good. And make sure you get nice, even strokes all the way across. Otherwise, it will dry in weird clumps because the paper warps. So there is layer number 1. While we wait for our base layer to dry, let's talk about Chinese ink painting, which is very, very similar to painting with coffee, and the process itself is very similar.
Unfettered by the strictures of tradition, Singaporean ink artists have been able to draw great value from ancient traditions of Chinese art and work with them creatively to produce artistic expressions unique to their circumstances. This series will explore how Chinese techniques and formats developed through the centuries came to be reworked by Singaporean artists. Chinese painting first evolved into a distinct art form separate from earlier types of artistic expression in the Six Dynasties period. Painting in China became consolidated into a single tradition, what we call Chinese painting, by the Song Dynasty. A series of invasions of the Song territories helped develop the idea of a Chinese nation, and Song artists used painting as a way to express this identity. There were two major traditions of Chinese painting that developed at this time: figure painting and landscape painting. Figure painters such as Li Gonglin and Liang Kai were inspired by ideas about morality and painted scenes that were lessons in moral behavior. These painters were usually inspired by older art forms such as religious murals and used them as a source of authority. A less direct expression of painters' anxieties emerged in the new genre of landscape painting, where artists such as Guo Xi and Xia Gui used mountains and rivers as symbols of their thoughts and emotions, as well as representations of the ideal secluded life. In the Ming and Qing dynasties, paintings in these two traditions became associated with the literati class and became the predominant art forms in China. In late Qing Shanghai, artists such as Ren Bonian and Wu Changshuo painted in bold and individualistic ways to compete for the commercial market's attention. These paintings favored bright, pleasing colors and everyday subject matter, and became known as the Shanghai School. The 1911 revolution ended imperial rule and gave birth to modern China. Ink painting became acknowledged as the national art form of modern China and was known as Guohua. Modern artists such as Xu Beihong, Lin Fengmian, and Wu Guanzhong took ideas from Western and Japanese paintings to modernize the traditional art.
Now that we have watched that, your painting should have started to dry a little bit. Everything should have started to settle down. And this is where we are going to be doing our second step, which is a continuous loop until you are satisfied with what you have. As you slowly layer your coffee paint, you will notice that it will continue to get darker and darker. Wait until each layer is dry before continuing to the next one, and add mountains and layers until you are satisfied. So I've brought you back here. Oh shoot. Yeah. Here we are again, and I am going to be taking my paintbrush, dipping it in some coffee and water, really just diluting it, starting pretty high up, and just making a line down across. It's going to be a pretty light layer, not very visible. It will dry more visible. I'm just going to bring it down. Now I understand that you can barely see what's happening. We are making our very first mountain. Just like that. That's the top line for our first mountain. Starting way up here. And the nice thing about coffee is it dries very harshly. So this line will darken quite a bit as it dries. We're going to bring some water and we're going to dilute it so that as we continue on, it does not become too dark. And see, as I dip my brush into this water and then dip it here, that the coffee separates, and you can just use your brush to pull it around. As you can see, my paper is warping very badly. I'm going to see if I can use the tape that I put on here to fix it just a bit. Just going to use my brush to pull that paint down so that this whole second layer here is the same color. You want everything to be all mixed together so that your layers look natural and consecutive. So I'm just adding different mixtures of coffee and water until it is the consistency that I am satisfied with. And because of this warping, it does tend to get moved around. If you need to, you can use your fingers or the side of a brush. I'm going to use this extra brush that I have here. Your fingers do leave a mark to just hold it down so that I can properly spread out the coffee so it can dry. Feel free to step back and take a break while you wait for this next layer to dry. You have to wait for it to be completely dry before you move on to your next step. And as you can see now, layer 1 is dry. You can see it a bit better now that it's dried out. It does dry darker. And now we are going to go to layer 2. So we're going to take just a bit water and a lot more coffee than we did before. We're going to pick a new spot to start our mountain. Now this side is a bit low, so I'm probably going to start above where we did this last mountain and bring it across like this. This is going to be a relatively flat mountain right here. So first we're going to darken this up so we can see our line. This layer is going to be just slightly darker than the one we did before. So as you can see, I'm making it pretty dark at the moment so that we can see where it is. You can see that top line. That's the most important one. Because of the warping, some of this is laying out a bit oddly, but that's okay. We work with what we've got. So that will be our next mountain. I'm going to put quite a bit of coffee on it. And I'm going to pull it down so that we can have a nice dark top edge. And then I'm going to take some water and I'm going to dilute it. The dilution will not only keep it from getting too dark too early, but will also help blend in this new layer of coffee to the layers of coffee underneath it. You want to be quick about this to make sure that everything mixes together in the proper way. And once you're sure that you've wetted all of the areas you want to have the next layer of coffee, take long and exact strokes to help everything mix together. And because this looks to be just the same color as this one, we're going to make it just a little darker, so we're going to add a bit more coffee. Just a bit, not a lot. I'm going to continue through the steps. Make sure you've mixed all of this together. Until you are satisfied with the line that you have for your next mountain. I'm going to add just a little more darkness to the top of mine. So by doing that, I'm taking a bit of coffee onto my paintbrush and simply tapping it, and the coffee will naturally spread through the moistness of the water. I'm just dabbing it on there. Don't be afraid to push down certain areas if it's warping pretty badly like mine is. And slide some things around if you're not satisfied where they ended up. So now that I've done this, I'm going to stop what I'm doing, and I've been using a blow dryer to speed up the process of drying. But you don't have to. You can just simply wait for it to dry and come back to it later. This is kind of like a on and off kind of thing. Now that my second layer is dry, we will continue on to my third layer. And as you can see, there are some spots on my painting that are a little bit blotchy. That's normal. That's not a big deal. That will happen. It will happen to me every time I try this, and it will most likely happen to you. But that's okay. That is the beauty of painting with coffee. So I will now begin putting my mountain where I think it should go. I think I'm going to have it start low on this side. This reminds me of when Bob Ross says, "Happy little trees." And then I'm going to keep it kind of straight. So let me show you where I made that line. Just like that. And I think I'm going to add one more layer after this. So I'm going to go ahead and get some water and some coffee and blend this down. I want this layer to be darker than the last. So as we progress through this, we're using just a bit more coffee each time. And then our last layer, we will be using just coffee. So we're going to put the darkness of the line where I want it to go. And mark out the top of my mountain. And because of the wet, this does not go anywhere that is not wet, because water tends to stick together and not run so much. Now that I have done that, I'm going to take water, I'm going to blend it out. And blend everything on this layer and the layer underneath it together. As I'm doing this, I'm just removing some of the tape I had on there. As you can see, this part is white, so I'm just going to go ahead and add in some coffee down here and then blend it out with water so that it just looks more normal, more natural. See a big puddle of coffee over here? Just going to take the side of my brush and push it away so that it doesn't all gather there. It's because of the warping. And you can also help with warping by blow drying it. You can move the coffee and the water around so it doesn't all clump up in one spot. And because I want this layer to be much darker than the one before it, I'm going to be using just a bit more coffee through here. Just sticking my brush into my coffee and just spreading it around. A little can go a long way, so don't go crazy with your coffee. You may end up with all the same color layers. Put some down here at the bottom since it seems to be extra white down here. And I will now be blow drying this layer with my blow dryer. And now that I have done that, you can see that our layering is coming across quite nicely. We will now do the last layer of our mountain, which is taking just the regular coffee and nothing else, and picking a spot and just pulling it across. Now this is going to be a very small mountain here at the bottom. Putting our happy little mountains. And just filling this up with coffee, just loading it up, making it as dark as it'll go. I'm going to get an extra paintbrush. I'm going to hold down where my edge is warping so that I can properly mix this around. Because this mountain right here above it is so tall, I think I'm going to heighten this mountain right here, just like that. And same on this side so that it's a little more even, a little more natural. Just load it up with coffee. There we go. And that is the last layer to our mountains. I'm going to go ahead and pause this recording so that I can blow dry it for you. All right, and now the last layer of our mountain is dry, which means we can move on to the next step. And that next step is details. Once you're satisfied with your mountains, you can now add just a little bit of detail. Make sure that your layers are sufficiently dry before you do this step. Use the side of your paintbrush and add trees along. That is optional, however. I am going to add a moon to mine. I think I'm going to add a big old moon right here, but you can add trees. Hold on, let me get my example for you. That is not completely dry. As you can see here, I dabbled around with my paintbrush to make trees. You can see my mountains here and my experimental moon. This was my experiments paper. So if you want to add trees, oh my gosh, I almost threw my paintbrush. Let me get my experiment paper for you. The way you would do so is you would dip your paintbrush into coffee and simply take the side of your paintbrush, the skinny side, and dab around like this. And this will give the effect of a tree with leaves. Or you can add a long stick for long trees. Just like that. I'm going to add a moon to mine, however, so I'm going to dip my paintbrush into my coffee, pick my spot, and make a moon. You can also add clouds. I think I may do that as well. We can have a large moon, so let's make it much bigger. Drop some extra coffee in there to make it darker. And because water itself is so contained, if I dip my paintbrush into this bowl of coffee and it drips into there, it will simply just spread out, but not go outside of the circle that I've created. I'm probably going to now I'm dipping my paintbrush into water to get most of the coffee out, to get just really light. I'm going to make some clouds. Just long, sweeping strokes. Nothing too dark. I'm going to go around my moon here. I don't want to mess with it. Once I'm satisfied with that, I will just get my blow dryer one more time and dry everything. As you can see, my painting is not completely dry. However, we are good enough to move on to the final step, which is leave it to dry. Your paper is definitely going to crinkle from the amount of water and coffee that you put on it. However, fear not. If you stick it between two heavy objects, it will eventually flatten out. And then you can have a perfectly flat piece of paper. But don't do that until it is completely dry. Otherwise, you may squish your painting around and the coffee and the paint will go everywhere.